Hello, everyone. Good to see you all here. Welcome to the first public lecture of the semester. I'm really glad that we actually finally managed to bring Dev to Glasgow, and then they all have the chance to experience such a great mind that is Dev. Dev is humbling, so that's why I'm gonna pretty much say that he's such a great mind, because he will never say that himself.
He's not met my children.
And this is one of the things that we have been trying to do since 2020, early 2020. We all know what happened. But so it's great to have him here. I think that I do not need to spend much time talking about Dev, because I'm sure you guys are all familiar with his work. And I think that Dev as a person, and also especially his work as well, speaks for itself. And I'm sure you want to hear more of that than me. So please, Dev, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis. Thanks. So thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing everything to get me here. And it's very good to be here. I've been meaning to come for a while, and then the pandemic sort of sideswiped things. So it's genuinely very good to be here. And I'd like to thank the 4 people sitting in that row for being here 20 minutes early for reasons unknown to me. And I'll try and live up to that in whatever way I can in terms of the talk itself. For those of you who've suffered through anything I've written, this is not my home territory. I am a trademark person. I am a geographical indications person. I dabble a little bit in copyright, and this is innovation policy. So this is new space for me, but I'm on sabbatical. And if you don't do new things when you're on sabbatical, then what's the point? So I very much welcome comments, feedback, sort of ways of thinking about things slightly differently. Why was I drawn to this? So Martin was asking sort of what led to this, and there were a few different reasons. I'm working with my colleague, Robert Burrell at Oxford, and he's worked on innovation policy for a while. And he's been looking at alternative incentivizing mechanisms, including a long history of offering people prizes for innovations. So a history of parliamentary prizes to get people to make spiffy new things that everyone agrees is a good idea. And so this fits into a larger pattern of non-patent type incentives, where the state puts incentives forward to get people to invent and create things. And so ARIA is a new government agency. It's a funding agency, and it funds high-risk innovation long shots. And that's really the gist of it. Now, the blurb for the talk had ARIA's IP-shaped hole. Things are moving fast. In the 3 weeks since I submitted that abstract, significant parts of that hole have been filled because they've sort of put forward draft agreements and come up with clauses. And so I have a slightly different title here because the hole is sort of on its way to being filled with content. And so it's ARIA's emergent IP policy ensuring taxpayers benefit. And so the very simple premise of this talk is, if the state is offering you money to do research, then what are the taxpayer benefits that flow to you from it in a model which otherwise gives you, the researcher, the IP that arises from that research? So the basic model is you get the patents, but what does the state get in return for supporting you? Because you can then go off and commercialize it. And that's really the question that's at the heart of this talk. So the key idea behind ARIA is empowering scientists to reach for the edge of the possible. It's an R&D funding agency built to unlock scientific breakthroughs that benefit sort of everybody. So transformative, long odds, moonshot kind of projects, that's really at the heart of this. And the question, the legal question underlying it is, for state-funded innovation, who owns the resulting IP? Well, the answer is clear. It's the researchers with some caveats. And then how does the state get a return through that initial allocation of the IP rights? That's really the core that's working here. The broader policy context, the book sort of cover captures it. Many of you will be familiar with that book. The starting point is a renewed interest in industrial policy. And by industrial policy, we really mean the state rolling up its sleeves and getting involved in the market in a way that is more active and interventionist. So it's selective government intervention and policies that attempt to alter the structure of production in favor of certain sectors and in favor of certain activities to facilitate growth. So what's the state doing? It's shaping, it's nudging, it's sort of skewing the playing field to favor certain bits of it. And it's going beyond a certain neoliberal sort of view of the state, which is it should just fix market failures. Instead, it's shaping and even creating markets. It's not just being a sort of a police person, but it's actually actively creating new market spaces. So we know that Mariana Mazzucato, many of us know, has written about this, and she's written about the entrepreneurial state. And she says the state can lead in setting directions for innovation. So ideas, catchphrases like mission-oriented innovation, responding to big challenges. So climate change, specific elements of climate change, safer AI, these are big missions. And the classic sort of mission-oriented thinking emerges from things like World War II, things like sort of the moonshot after that. These are classic big missions where you set them out and then you try and drive innovation along those grooves. And the thinking here is it isn't interfering with the market mechanism, because usually the market allocates efficiently. The thinking here is it doesn't crowd out that efficient private investment, but it crowds in. It creates a space which looks attractive through sort of policy, and then people jump in and fill that space. So it's making possible things which wouldn't otherwise be done. And that's really what it's trying to do with this kind of agency. But in setting up these spaces and making them attractive, the state is taking risks by throwing money at these spaces. So what does the state get in return for taking those risks is the question. We know what a venture capitalist mindset would say about risks and what the VC gets back in return. But what does the state get back in return for sort of throwing money at these kinds of problems? That's really at the heart of, the political economy sort of context for this talk. The idea for ARIA as an agency comes from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the US. Initially, it was just ARPA, then the defense got tagged onto it sort of a few years after it was set up. And it gave us, as famously many of us know, the predecessor to the internet, ARPANET, because you wanted a system with redundancy and resilience built in. No one central node. You needed a distributed system in case there was an attack somewhere. You needed a system that could survive. It gave us the modern sort of internet. GPS, again, so cheap GPS technology in individual mobile phones, which can track people. It can be traced back to early investments. Voice recognition, autonomous vehicles. So that's a lovely old clunky picture from 2003, 2004. That's the desert. They set out this grand $1 million challenge, DARPA. Everybody failed. Every single car failed. People failed spectacularly and people failed sort of less spectacularly. And those were the successes. But what did it really do? It set up a group of people talking to each other about what's possible in terms of autonomous vehicles. And that really built up momentum. And that's why the US is taking the lead in autonomous vehicles is the causal story that's sort of told there. So this is the idea for ARIA here. It's legislation which creates a new body to fund transformative research. And its objectives are to champion this kind of research, which is high risk, high reward. It's got a budget of about £800 million. And this budget is for a 4-year period, and we'll see how it allocates that money and to whom it allocates this money. The DARPA story has been attracting attention for sort of several years now, and we can see a whole cohort of what were originally called clones, but they don't work the same way. So they're loosely called cousins. And so within the US, you can see acronyms which are not the most creative, would fail sort of the copyright lawyer test. But you've got IARPA for intelligence, ARPA-E for energy, ARPA-H for health, ARPA-C for climate. Many people say, if you've got ARPA-E, do you need ARPA-C? Why do you have two sort of organizations throwing money at risky sort of ventures in this space? But then you see the model percolating out to other countries as well. And a whole bunch of them. There's a trademark infringement one and the second one down there straight away. You've got JEDI sort of in Europe. I had to get back onto my home turf somehow. And you've got the idea catching and the idea traveling. These high risk, high reward sort of funding agencies and this cohort of cousins sort of emerging. Now, ARIA has been described as a part of this cohort as a visionary move. It's one of these phrases that people love throwing around. So in 2022, 2023, as it's getting set up, people are talking about it as being this visionary organization funding visionary researchers who are going to solve the global sort of the challenging problems of our day. But if we stop to think about who came up with, in the sense of who wanted to implement this idea, here's sort of a visual a cue for you guys. It's a test. So there's a castle in the background, there's a car, there's somebody who's driven to the castle as an eyesight test. The moment you get the name, shout it out, then you can boo if you want to, like a pantomime villain, forthrightly, but don't hold it against the agency. Who are we talking about here in terms of whose initiative this was? Who drove famously to a castle notionally to test their eyes? There's people there too polite to say it in public, but it is. Anybody want to help us out here? It is Dominic Cummings. So it's Dominic Cummings who famously drove to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight. This is an art student, I think, from Birmingham, who put a car together with sort of moving text. All the excuses Dominic Cummings gave at a press conference are part of the moving text on the car. And this is a brilliant idea. And if you look closely, eyesight is misspelled as well. So that's just the sort of icing on the cake. So it comes from, this, let's pull the state back, let's free this organization up to be nimble and agile and throw money at risky things. That's the sort of mindset it comes from, but don't hold the provenance or the DNA sort of against ARIA as an agency. So what are its design principles? Well, it's designed to have strategic autonomy, but many funding agencies have a large degree of strategic autonomy in the sense of no directions in terms of where the funding is to be spent coming from government. So the government doesn't set out the direction. They sort of bubble up from ideas given by the researchers. It's got not only strategic autonomy, but it's got operational autonomy as well. Independent leadership to set their own priorities and procedures. The thinking is very much minimal bureaucracy, far fewer layers of approval and review. The comparative for these nimble agencies is conventional funding. So UKRI would be the big sort of comparator in the UK, and that has a grants-based process. Researchers have to apply. There's a peer review process, and maybe the stereotype is it tends towards safe research towards the middle, which other people, your panel of referees will get. They'll say, this is a valid project. Why? Because we know something about it. The moment you present something that is completely a long shot, the referees are going to say, but this is too long odds. We're not going to really throw money at it. So they want to sort of thin out the bureaucratic layers and also to attract people who aren't your usual suspects, people who aren't used to filing for research grants, people from industry, garage tinkerers, people who just come in with good ideas from a range of different places. The idea is to invest in the judgment of talented people. So there's a program manager model. And the program manager, she orchestrates a space. She sets out a space and says, here's where I think we can get something transformative. Let's build some modules into it in terms of achievable targets. One of the original documents for ARIA had as the basic concept they were trying to sell. What if someone came to us with very fancy language for what's essentially a jetpack? And like as a cartoon watching kid, as a science fiction loving adult, that just got me when I read the policy document. So if you were trying to build a jetpack, what's the modules, the series of modules you'd need to work out, and the prototypes and the testing, and these are the modules you'd want the program manager to sort of work out and sort of develop. Then there's flexibility in funding approaches. At the core is a grant. They throw money at you, but it's also spin-out companies, buying equity stakes, prizes. There's a range of things ARIA can experiment with in terms of the funding model. And finally, an open agenda. There is no specified research focus for the organization, but you can have strands and themes emerge, and we'll see them in a couple of slides. And it covers all stages from upstream basic or fundamental research down to more applied research and sort of prototypes and actual technology, and bridging research to bridge between the two, from sort of basic science to actual applications, and then even commercialization of prototypes as well. So what are we talking about in terms of the kinds of things they're funding? So I have chosen Jenny's sort of opportunity space to show it off. On the right, on the side, you can see the bullet points. Each program director gets a £50 million budget to spend on developing these opportunity spaces. Some of the other opportunity spaces are, for example, interfacing with the human brain at scale. And if you go down to the bottom, managing our climate and weather through responsible engineering. So adaptive buildings, adaptive structures, things that can work with a world of climate change. And the last one's really interesting. Programmable plants, a technology platform for sustainable abundance. So programming plants through sort of technology to generate food crops, to generate sort of the things that we need. But on this particular one, which is quite interesting, smart machines need smarter bodies. As computing power increases, we're talking about AI, quantum computing, the brains are getting smarter, but the robot bodies haven't really sort of kept up. So what is Jenny's big idea? She's saying, let's look to nature to build smarter robot bodies. If you build the design of the body well enough, you then don't need a super sophisticated brain to control it if the body design is good enough. And what she's trying to argue is insects don't have super sophisticated brains, but they have autonomous and independent wings. And it's the frequency at which the muscles move and at which they can fly, which sort of almost, it matches other frequencies inside the body. So the design of the wings is so smart that you don't need a superpowered brain to actually make the wings work. Another example is, she gives the example of animal bodies have a protective, flexible, waterproof, washable, self-healing covering, densely studded with sensors for pressure, temperature, and tissue damage. And we call it skin. Can you imagine a robot which had something like skin and the kind of sort of interactions and work it could do? So the inspiration is nature. The idea is smarter bodies. The thinking is the world is shifting to older populations, and we're going to need quite literally somebody to do the heavy lifting. So we need robots, we need smarter robots, and smarter bodies are going to need to go along with those smarter robots. So this is the idea of an opportunity space, and then the modules within it to try and sort of get there. So that's the thinking behind ARIA. And at the core of it is the state pays for the grant. So the government sort of stumps up the money for this, and that's in Section 4 of the Act of 2022, the ARIA Act. The Secretary of State makes grants to ARIA, in this case, £800 million over 4 years. And there could be certain conditions attached. And what are ARIA's aims? To do this kind of research, to conduct basic scientific research, to develop and exploit scientific knowledge, so to move towards prototypes and commercialization, and to disseminate sort of both fundamental research and new technological development. So that's what it's aiming to do. It's very clear this is a high-risk, high-reward agency. Section 3 is clear about that. And why they're emphasizing high-risk, high-reward is because they want to flag up there will be failures. There will be large sums of public money thrown at things which will not work in the way that they've promised. And we need to unclench and be okay about that. That's really what the legislation is sort of flagging up in advance. Why it's also important to flag this up is because our metrics for evaluating the success of the organization are going to have to take on board the fact that things are going to fail spectacularly and often because it's a risky business. And that's a tricky way of then setting up an assessment structure for how ARIA is going to be doing well. And we can talk a little bit about how DARPA, the originator model, is handled sort of the success stories. And maybe just a quick segue into DARPA here. People have tried to ask whether the US DARPA agency has succeeded. The anecdotal evidence is yes, it has. It's given us all of these sort of wonderful technologies. But you haven't asked the questions about opportunity costs. What else could the money have been spent on? Was this the best route to get there? Were there meanderings? Should we measure it in patents and citations? You know, the standard kind of metrics of success. And alternatively, if you count the internet as coming from DARPA, that one win probably just covers everything that they've ever sort of funded previously. So for high risk, long shot, transformative, couldn't see it 10 years ago kind of innovation, how do you measure the success of an agency is a really tricky question. And feeling our way into this, bearing in mind it's high risk, is something that's going to have to be figured out. One of the other key provisions in Section 2 is, well, the British state is paying for it, so how do we ensure the state sees some benefits? And this is what I want to unravel as we go through the rest of the talk. So ARIA needs to do these things across A, B, and C, contribute to economic growth or the economic benefit of the UK, promote scientific innovation and invention in the UK, or improve the quality of life here and elsewhere. And I think with an eye to environmental technology, you can see where they're going. So now that we know a little bit about its design and what it's intended to do, what are some of the challenges and coordination issues facing an agency like this? One of them, and many of them are not IP issues. These are sort of almost public law, administrative law, just design kind of issues. How do you balance agility and less bureaucracy with accountability? All I need to say is sort of pandemic equipment funding, and just look at the mess where a nimble light touch kind of system got us in terms of people commissioning things with are then rubbish or kind of below spec or just not used. So very light touch also kind of leads to problems. How do you measure value for money? That's what we were just talking about previously, stuff that you couldn't, how do you measure the value of the internet arising from something? How do you develop the right institutional culture, which is risk-taking, it's ambitious, but it's also responsible? And here, if you look at the sociologists who study the history of DARPA, there's something very interesting going on there. DARPA is designed to have a very thin tier of management. Then it's got these program managers, and then it's got performers, the people who are running the modules and actually building the stuff. And there's a high turnover rate at most of these layers. People at the top tend to stay, and they tend to be former project managers who then go up into management. You've got project managers who last between usually about 5 years, that's their tenure, and it's not a revolving door. You can't come back in as a project manager once you've sort of been there. And then you've got the people who are actually the performers, building the prototypes, sort of doing the experiments, doing the modules. And these people sort of churn through quite quickly. Some of them go off and join a penumbra of consultancies around DARPA. And they are the people who then rejoin the projects enduringly. So the irony is the consultants end up being almost the permanent people in DARPA, because this is a stable core of expert consultants, usually for military tech, who keep coming back in for different projects. They have been program managers formally, because the permanent people in the institution are on 5-year cycles and kind of turn around. And that's quite interesting as well. It's the outside consultants who give some kind of enduring sort of structure to this organization and build its institutional culture. And that's the point in the middle. One of the other points is, how do you develop a network of collaboration with existing funding bodies? So if you go back to the example from the US of ARPA-E and ARPA-C, that's the energy and the climate sort of models. Lots of private sector money is being thrown at climate technology. So why should these guys also throw money at climate technology if there is a lot of alternative sources of funding? Whereas for military tech or space tech or stuff or vaccines that are not going to be otherwise developed, there are cases where not enough people are throwing money at it, and you need the state to throw money at it. So we're not really sure about whether ARIA is going to overlap, because it's a general technology development body. So can we avoid overlaps? And one of the other things that's different from DARPA is DARPA has a major client. That client is the US Department of Defense. And I'm going to come to this point later on, but I'll flag it here. One of the reasons why we maybe don't see IP issues is the tech developed by DARPA feeds into military applications initially or primarily. And my reading of a lot of sophisticated institutional analysis literature is you don't mess around with your clients if they have a lot of guns. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but that's really why you have a big purchaser and you're going to be selling the tech you develop to the US state, the military. You need to be on good terms with them and not mess around, because they are your client. And you have a steady, stable, repeat client, and you want to keep going back to them. And so therefore, you're not going to mess around with prices and licensing terms, because these guys are a recurrent client and they're always going to be there in the background. ARIA doesn't have that. ARIA doesn't have a recurring client, and that's another problem. And then what is ARIA's IP policy? And when I advertised the talk initially, there was no formal IP policy at the, up and running, and it's just being in the process of being filled in. ARIA is willing to talk to Robert and myself. We're trying to arrange a meeting. And so we're hoping that this research maps out some of the pitfalls and problems for them. We're not sort of out to diss, what they're trying to do. We're saying, have you thought about, look at this comparator, what's happening over there, and maybe we can learn something from it. So that's really where this talk is coming from. And we're looking forward to seeing what their thinking is on their IP policy. It wasn't there in the beginning because the Act doesn't really say anything about IP at all. So if you look at the very brief 2022 Act, it really says ARIA can make use of its property to support research. And as part of that portfolio of property, we include things like patents. So if ARIA has a patent because someone developed something but didn't want it, couldn't commercialize it, wanted to give it back to ARIA, and it's got a portfolio, a library of patents lying around, and somebody else needs a patent, it can give them labs, facilities, old machines, and yeah, it can give them patents as well. That's the first and only mention of IP. In the governance framework agreement, you start seeing questions about, well, if we're paying for this, then where's the innovation going? Like, where is it sort of going, and can we sort of track it and make sure we get the benefits? So since its research should benefit the UK, it should have particular regard for how its IP assets generated will benefit the UK's prosperity and security. Is it going to flow? So that's one of the questions. There are separate national security sort of legislations which step in on the security question, but it's really where is the IP going and will the UK see a benefit for it in return for sort of funding it? That's sort of the main question there. So the details of the IP emerge in more detail finally in the draft grant agreements. In the contracts is where we start seeing their approach to IP. These are very recent agreements. These are drafts, so I'm flagging it with the usual caveats. And I'm normally very happy for recordings of talks to be released, but because this is also emergent and contingent, we're going to see if we can sort of put up some version of this talk. But much of what I say, I suspect, is going to be overridden in the next couple of weeks because this is a moving set of targets. What is ARIA's approach to IP? The recipients, the project managers, the actual performers, the people developing the tech, recipients will own any new intellectual property generated as a result of the grant or the contract. So the people building the tech will own the tech, the researchers will own the IP in it. ARIA will need some rights to the new IP to help us evaluate the outputs during the funding agreement period. So we'll need to access the technology and have certain rights to assess and test and evaluate it. We've also included some provisions which basically say, since we're paying for it as a state, we need to see some benefit in return for it. But these provisions have been designed to say the state needs to see some benefit, but they're not sort of ties and restrictions which will inhibit you from commercializing it onwards. So we need to see something back, but we're not tying you down. You can take it and commercialize it and go onwards. And we see if they've reached this sort of balance point. So what does the actual text of the agreement say? Here's an offer letter version of 5th Jan 2024, so earlier this month. Some standard stuff, throat clearing stuff in the beginning. First, a warranty in clause 4 saying anything you develop under the project shouldn't infringe other people's IP rights. So if ARIA is going to end up using this IP, we shouldn't be stepping on other people's IP toes when we're using it, and you warrant that it's okay to do so. Then conditions start emerging in Schedule 1. So you see a clause which says when ARIA needs to prove that it's delivering value for money when it's sort of audited by the state. So you, as the people holding the IP, need to give us information about what you're doing with the IP. Are you licensing? Are you building? Are you commercializing? What are you going to be doing with this? Have you disseminated the results? And we need to build up a database of this. Why this is important is research from the US suggests that where institutions like the NIH, somebody's having more fun than us. I'm sorry, this talk is not, can't compete with that. I wish them well. And I apologize. So you sort of, the US research suggests that the National Institutes of Health, which throw billions at the public funding of health, are supposed to have a database which shows who is using the technology that is derived from that. It's supposed to document, it's supposed to show who's licensing on what terms, and that database can be very easily overridden by trade secrecy, by confidentiality, parties saying we have reasons to not put stuff in the database, and the auditing and the following up of that database is not done. So in a sense, the basic information you need for accountability and for auditing and accounting, we've given you all this money, at least what have you done with it? What are the downstream benefits? We need an accurate record of that. So if this provision's in there, we're hoping it generates some genuinely useful information. Another clause says that we will respect you, the party developing the technology's confidentiality, and any know-how generated during the use of during the project itself, ongoing sort of use of know-how, that should be shared between the parties, and ARIA can continue to use that. What ARIA is therefore trying to do is say, We will respect confidential information that parties bring to the tech they're trying to develop, but any new know-how or insights in terms of practical stuff we develop during the making of the technology, ARIA should hold and then can give to other people who are working in a similar space as well, and sort of make sure it's spread around. And that's part of the thinking here. We start turning to some of the more prominent IP provisions in clause 15 and 16. 15.1 says you must act in good faith when it comes to some of the good stuff the state is trying to do and get something back for its investment. You shouldn't try and avoid it by artificial means. And this agreement does not affect the ownership of your background IP rights. And these terms tend to have standard terminology. There's background IP, stuff you already had. There's foreground IP, stuff you develop on the project. And some people refer to sideground IP, which is stuff that you develop during the project, but is not directly related to the project. It's sort of on the side. So foreground IP is the only stuff where, the content we're focusing on, but the background remains yours, and sideground for these purposes is put in the background as well. That remains with you. In terms of the state getting a benefit, you start seeing that most directly in terms of the state's ability to buy the technology that is developed at a discounted rate. You develop a fantastic new vaccine or a health diagnostic test or a green technology that can be immediately implemented and lead to savings. The state can step in as a buyer, and the state can get a discounted price as a buyer for up to twice the approved cost of the project. That's your budget. So you can keep going up to twice the approved cost of the project. So really it's saying it gets back, twice it's spent on the project through this discount for really great tech, a really great tech that is developed. And after it's got this state discount, this crown discount price, it then gets the best available price you're offering it to any other party in similar volumes. So it's a most favored nation clause to all the trade lawyers in the room. We're familiar with that kind of clause. You get it at the best available rate you're offering it to anybody else. There's also an obligation to keep accounts on the party to make sure you're fulfilling both of these obligations. We turn to then the really interesting sort of stuff in terms of foreground IP ownership and licensing. The agreement begins by saying the foreground IP, stereotypically the patents, possibly the trade secrets, the data that you sort of generate, data is put in the IP box for these reasons. The foreground IP shall belong to you, subject to the following three conditions. You hereby grant ARIA a UK-wide, irrevocable, royalty-free, non-exclusive license to use the foreground IP for program use. So ARIA gets a free of conditions license, but the scope of that license is internal for program use, other ARIA projects. So it's allowed to move the tech around within the ARIA ecosystem. Seems to be the sort of impulse here. For non-commercial purposes within its programs, including to other participants in other ARIA programs, subject to confidentiality obligations. So at least circulated within that space. B is the most interesting provision. It says you will cooperate with ARIA to facilitate collaborations and future licensing agreements with third parties. So you work with ARIA to take this tech to third parties to develop and commercialize the foreground IP generated, subject to fair and reasonable terms. I'm not clear on something quite fundamental about this. I think there is a favored reading of this clause. To me, it seems to be saying you need to come with us to the negotiating table, us being ARIA, you being the party who's developed the technology. And let's try and find other people, other commercial partners who will help us to develop and commercialize this technology, take it to market. So at that stage, you need to come to us and you need to be willing to license the tech, which you own at the top of the slide, to these guys who are willing to help us commercialize it on fair and reasonable terms. If that reading of the clause is correct, what they're saying is you need to work reasonably and nicely with us to help the tech get to market. And after that, the clause ends and doesn't say anything else. The broader reading of the clause would be get to market means all the way into market, and how the tech behaves and is sold on the market is also relevant for us. So there are two readings of this clause. One could be play nicely until you get the tech to the market. The other is play nicely all the way onto the market and your behavior on the market as well. And I'm not sure it reaches all the way to that level. I think what they're trying to do is commercialize it and bring the technology to market. But beyond that, and I'm very interested in the competition lawyers in the room and sort of their readings of this, but beyond that, do they also want to make sure, for example, it's not sold as some pharmaceuticals are, which have been developed with vast state funding in the upstream stages? And we'll come to sort of slides talking about that. Will the eventual product be sold at a very high price once it's on the market because you've got the patents and you've got the monopoly, is what I'm not sure this particular clause can address. Are you with me on the difference, the two different readings on this clause? Does it stop at getting stuff to the market, or does it also regulate behavior once you're on the market as well? And that's the basic difference. And finally, when you assign or exclusively license the foreground IP to a third party, you essentially hand it over to somebody else. You must impose all of these relevant terms on that third party as well. But B is the clause that I'm most interested in. Finally, just some wrapping up provisions. Non-UK commercialization is permitted because non-UK grant applications are permitted. ARIA is not restricted to UK applicants for funding. The people who are applying can come from anywhere. So therefore, there was a whole debate as the legislation was progressing through Parliament all the way up to the Lords. And they were saying, how do we ensure that once we've funded this, the tech doesn't disappear over the horizon and it's been sold to somebody in a third country and we never get to see any of it here? So the answer seems to be, well, let the tech flow wherever it needs to flow, as long as we get something back. That's the simple answer. So pay us if you're letting the tech flow outside is the basic model they've tried to wire into this. So Schedule 3, Annex 1 has a clause for inclusion in licenses to the foreground IP to say the commercialization should be as free as possible. So you don't need pre-vetting or consent if you're selling to any non-UK entity, selling exclusively licensing the foreground IP to a non-UK entity. But if a non-UK entity threshold is triggered, then there is a payment of an ARIA non-UK fee in each of the following circumstances. The holder of the IP flips and becomes a non-UK entity or starts off as a non-UK entity, and they exploit the foreground IP themselves. They've got to pay up, and we'll see what the rates are. If you start off being a UK entity and you assign or license outside, then you've got to pay up the rates as well. Or where you assign to somebody who subsequently becomes a non-UK entity, you've got to pay up in these three circumstances. And what are the payments? These are annual payments. It could either be a royalty percentage if you're effectively handing over the IP, or if you're using the IP to make the products which contain the IP yourself, then 0.25% of the net sales, payable 10 years from the date of the first sale. So the two examples below sort of capture it for you. If you're actually using it to make stuff, then it's sort of a modest royalty rate. For each product, 0.25 if you're selling it for £100. If you're licensing or assigning it outside, they want a chunkier additional royalty rate of 25%. And that's what they're getting back. So summarizing the benefits, one of the benefits that's not baked into the legislation, but is behind it in terms of the spirit of it, is making people talk to each other. That's the first bullet point in a nutshell. Positive spillovers in the form of building networks, expertise, and communities of practice, companies, scientists, engineers, venture capitalists, and universities talking to each other, which in turn enables proper commercialization of technology, a multi or cross-disciplinary conversation, which actually tries to bring things to the market and get science into technology and out there. Possibly tax revenues from businesses built around successful products, but you know why I've put three sort of question marks there in terms of whether you actually ever see any of these tax revenues or not, or people just play very sort of quick and clever avoidance games and boot their tax base somewhere else, and the state doesn't end up seeing anything as a result of it. You do see a crown discount when the state wants to purchase the technology, but the state may not always want to purchase the technology. Not everything is a vaccine, which the state wants to buy and step in. You could have some really good tech, which the state doesn't want to buy, but wants to see out there at a reasonable price for people in the market to buy, and what happens in those circumstances. And then you have an ARIA non-UK fee when it's held by people outside the UK, so you get something back. And finally, this nudge to get the product to market, to commercialize. You will cooperate with ARIA. This is a clause in yellow highlight I was interested in, to facilitate collaborations and future licensing agreements to develop and commercialize the foreground IP, subject to fair and reasonable terms. So this is where we're at, but where it doesn't seem to, what ARIA doesn't seem to be talking about is, once the technology is developed to the point of commercialization, on what terms, and by terms I include price, does it become available to people on the market? And the paradigm concern is the state helping to develop pharmaceutical technology, pharmaceutical products, which are then sold at eye-wateringly, unfairly, palpably, so there's something wrong here, kind of high prices. And that is really the unanswered sort of question. Cautionary tales from other models of public funding. So we see other countries attempting to grapple with this, and these are the last sort of 5 or 6 slides, and we'll wrap up quite quickly. In the US, there was a big push in 1980 to get the public sector, universities in particular, but also small businesses, to take the research they were doing and push it from the lab to the marketplace. The key move was by saying, well, where the government funds research, and in this case, it was federal funding in the US, you as the developer of the technology get to own that research. And that was a big move because earlier, some people would say if the state has funded it, the state gets the patents, but then doesn't do very much with it. This now said, we pay, you get the IP, but, and there are a few sort of caveats to it. The legislation allowed universities, small businesses, nonprofits, and now all parties, not just these parties, to opt in to retain ownership of inventions, patents developed through federally funded research, but with certain counterbalancing provisions. The question was, do the counterbalancing provisions work? Because a lot of federally funded research ends up in products, in the pharmaceutical sector in particular, which are sold at extremely high prices. And this is the slide here with the image. This is the case study which sort of develops the concerns around that image. So the prostate cancer treatment, enzalutamide, invented by researchers at UCLA with funding from the state, the 2 different sources, has an average US wholesale price of $190,000 a year. And even with sort of Medicaid and other ways of subsidizing it, it's several times higher than the average wholesale price in other countries. So lots of state funding in terms of building up and developing this drug, and an astronomically high price for the drug at the end of it. And that is the gap that doesn't seem to have been addressed in the ARIA model. So people who've been looking at 40 years of operation of this legislation are saying it was supposed to make public funding bring products to market, but what happened to them after they were put on the market? That's the bit of the story we need to sort of look at. We had counterbalancing provisions here. So one of the counterbalancing provisions was giving the government a royalty-free permanent worldwide license to use any subject invention arising from work funded through federal grants. It's never been applied. The government gets a fantastically generous license. It's never been applied to biomedical technologies. The scope of this license is unclear. Can the government pass it on downstream, the license to this technology, to researchers working on developing it further? Sort of not just applying the technology, but building it kind of further outwards. And often the problem is not that one patent or those 5 patents which results from state funding. It's the whole constellation of other patents around it locked into the same product, which effectively stop you from commercializing it. So just opening up those 5 patents is not really going to solve the problem here. You also have march-in rights under 4 conditions. Americans don't like the word compulsory license, so they've used march-in instead. And that's really saying, look, if you are sitting on your patent and not using it, or you're not even applying for your patent, or it's a public health emergency, we can march in and effectively use compulsory licenses to crank out this tech type. Give other people the technology, allow them to use it. But what's unclear is if it is available to the public on reasonable terms, and that's one of the trigger conditions. It's not available to the public on reasonable terms. Is an unreasonable price something that fits within that phrase? Has been an open debate in the US for decades now. Should reasonableness include price? Sometimes the state threatens to use this provision to liberalize licensing. The last time they did was in the avian flu sort of vaccine, but it's never been used. The same problem as above, it won't capture all of the other patents. And the database that's supposed to document who's done what with state-funded patents is very poorly maintained. And that's the problem I alluded to earlier. So we're trying to look at other models in this project. Robert and I are trying to see how other people are addressing it. Bidoil and its limits we've seen. There's Horizon Europe, which is the EU equivalent for big sort of innovative kind of funding projects. They use fair and reasonable conditions in several places. So what's their understanding of it there? The US has one of the ARPA clones called ARPA-E for energy, and that is not got the military as its client, so it's a little more like ARIA. It's general energy sort of technology facing the private sector. So how are they handling their IP policies? Is there anything in FRIEND, which has fair and reasonable as part of its terminology, to consider? What does the US National Institutes of Health sort of do as well? So we'll end briefly with these two examples, Horizon Europe and then sort of ARPA-E. Horizon Europe has these fair and reasonable conditions as part of its IP licensing framework, but it's really saying when many people are collaborating within the same grant on the same project, you need to share on fair and reasonable terms within each other, including any background IP of your own, which would help the project to work. So it's really within the group you should share nicely, because the group as a whole has to succeed. It's not saying share nicely with everybody in the market who wants to buy your product. So it's a very inward-looking sort of shared, be fair kind of model. It also has fair and reasonable conditions when there's a crisis. So the pandemic potentially, at that point, you need to license your technology if it helps us with this pandemic on fair and reasonable conditions, but that's a very high threshold and it's not going to be met sort of all the time. So there may not be much in there. ARPA-E is the final sort of case study, and we're 2 slides away from the end. It's supposed to be a successful successor, and I set myself a tongue twister with that title, a successful successor of sort of DARPA. Why? Because not military, driving towards sort of private sector facing technology. The private sector is picking up on some of this technology. It's match funding sort of initiatives. It's companies and spin-offs have been formed by this. Their market valuations and sort of exits where the IP is sold, licenses have emerged, patents have emerged, and licenses have emerged from it. So this might be a sort of a successful predecessor for ARIA to look at more closely. And their funding agreement has very similar clauses to ARIA as well. They start by giving the title to the inventor or the researcher, but then the researcher or inventor who holds the patent has certain obligations. They have to report the inventions to the Department of Energy, and whether they filed patents or not. The government gets this generous government use license as well. The government retains the march-in or compulsory license rights, and that's an example of the kind of thing that ARPA-E is funding. Those are sort of more compact electric car kind of batteries, which have a jelly casing, which allows you to put more batteries together more safely, so you can cram things together and make them smaller and more efficient. So that's just an example of an ARPA-E project, and the green stuff is the jelly around the very literal kind of sort of thing. It's the jelly around the batteries. You can pack them together, make them sort of more efficient. And that's the kind of technology they want out there and being licensed. But again, nothing on prices, nothing on the pharmaceutical worry scenario. It's killer technology. It's amazing. It's going to do brilliant things. And we are the only guys in the market who have it, and we get to set the price. At that point, all of these agreements seem silent. So the interim conclusions are there are a range of ways in which the state will benefit from the new ARIA entity, and it will encourage the innovation ecosystem by getting people to talk to each other. But the drive has been to get inventions or new discoveries to the market. But what happens to them once they get onto the market, the accessibly priced product, that just sort of fizzles out. Nobody's talking about that. So we're up against possibly the neoliberal sort of bulwark of hands off my property. It's my patent now. Yes, you've helped me and paid part of the research cost for me to get here. And compulsory licensing has never been a shining sort of success. So we're not really sure what happens at that stage. The people who have been looking at why there hasn't been such an abuse in the rest of the DARPA ecosystem, its clones, they have been suggesting that you've got to create a series of partnerships where people know they're working with each other in the longer term, either because you're selling to the Department of Defense and they're always going to be your client, so you don't mess around with your long-term client, or you know you're working with each other, not just for this green energy project, but it's been so successful, you want to work together for a series of other projects as well. And so people are looking like very successful innovation states like Israel, and they're saying they've forced people into collaborative arrangements and used non-IP sticks to get people to continue to play nicely with each other, even after the formal IP gets settled. And that sort of non-IP regulatory framework around the groupings is maybe where the answer lies, because what happens to the overpriced product? Does IP have an answer? Doesn't seem to have too many success stories. So these are interim results, and that's why I find this space interesting. Thank you for listening. I'd welcome questions. Thank you very much.